If you just casually scroll through the news today, and we're looking at the landscape as of April 15th, 2026, right?
Right.
You see these massive, bold headlines declaring a ceasefire in the Middle East. And it sounds, like a moment to exhale.
Yeah, a bit of good news for once.
Exactly. But then you zoom in on the actual map, specifically looking at the Strait of Hormuz, and you see something that makes absolutely no sense.
Mm-hmm.
The United States is supposedly enforcing this strict naval blockade on Iran. So, which is it? Are we looking at a region finding peace or a superpower basically choking off one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet?
It's the ultimate geopolitical paradox, honestly. You have this rhetoric of de-escalation completely colliding with the actual mechanics of a naval quarantine.
Right.
And normally, a blockade is binary. You park a wall of steel in the water, you draw a line, you say nothing crosses.
Yeah, it's the purest projection of state power.
Exactly. But the reality playing out right now is infinitely more complicated and, frankly, a lot more fragile than the official narrative would have us believe.
And to figure out how we got into this labyrinth, we're unpacking a really fascinating, highly detailed breakdown today.
Oh, it is incredibly dense.
So dense. We're looking at a recent, really deep-in-the-weeds interview with former CIA analyst Larry Johnson, who was speaking on Glenn Deason's platform. Now, right out of the gate, we need to set the table here for you.
Yeah, a disclaimer is definitely needed.
For sure. Johnson throws a lot of heat in this interview. He makes some incredibly harsh, controversial assessments about the current U.S. administration, the Pentagon's leadership, and various heads of state.
Very harsh. It's a highly critical perspective of the entire Western strategic apparatus.
Right, and our goal today isn't to play judge and jury on the politics of it. We aren't here to co-sign his worldview or, endorse his political critiques.
No, not at all.
Think of us as mechanics. We're going to rip the engine out of his analysis, lay the parts out on the table, and examine exactly how he claims this geopolitical machine is functioning.
Or, more accurately, how it's breaking down.
Exactly. Because the picture painted here isn't just about some ships playing chicken in the Persian Gulf. He's outlining this massive chain reaction.
A cascading failure, really.
Yeah. We're talking military overstretch, triggering a global economic earthquake, bleeding into absolute chaos in the Oval Office, and culminating in what he argues is a fundamental, permanent collapse of American unipolar power.
It is a sweeping assessment, and to really grasp the magnitude of that chain reaction, you have to start at the absolute physical origin point. You have to look at the water.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the gap between the press briefings and the water is staggering. The official line from Washington is that this blockade is an ironclad net, right? Total quarantine.
That's the claim, yes.
But the analysis from insiders on the ground uses a phrase that is almost comical in its disrespect. They call the U.S. naval presence a mall cop.
A mall cop. It's a devastating analogy.
That really is.
Think about what a mall security guard actually does. They wear a uniform, they drive a little cart with a flashing light, and their entire job relies on the illusion of authority.
Right. People comply because they see the badge.
Exactly. But the moment someone decides to just, walk past them, the guard doesn't actually have the physical capability or the legal mandate to tackle them to the ground.
Yeah, they just watch them go.
And that is exactly how Johnson describes the U.S. posture in the Strait of Hormuz right now. Chinese vessels, heavily laden with Iranian oil, are reportedly just sailing straight through the American perimeter, completely unbothered.
Okay, I have to stop you there, because my brain short-circuits at that image. We are talking about the United States Navy.
The most powerful navy in the world.
Right. The most lavishly funded, technologically supreme military force in human history. How do they get reduced to Paul Blart on the open ocean? Is this a political mandate like, don't shoot because we don't want a war? Or is it a literal physical inability to stop these massive, slow-moving oil tankers?
It's heavily weighted toward physical and geographical inability, compounded by the realities of modern surveillance.
How so?
Well, it's easy to look at a map and think, the strait is narrow, just put a ship there.
Right.
But the ocean is incomprehensibly vast, and tracking a ship isn't like tracking a car on a highway.
Right.
In the maritime world, ships use an automatic identification system, or AIS. It's a transponder that pings a signal to satellites and other ships saying, I am a commercial tanker, here is my speed and heading.
The friend or foe broadcast.
Exactly. But if a Chinese vessel wants to run a blockade, the first thing they do is flip that switch off. They go dark.
And when they go dark,
You are virtually blind. You might pick up a radar return, a blip, but a radar blip doesn't tell you if that massive hunk of metal is a hostile military frigate, a sanctioned oil tanker, or just a random commercial freighter carrying, like, sneakers.
So you have to go look at it.
Right. To actually enforce a blockade on a dark ship, you can't just look at a screen. You have to physically send a destroyer, launch a Seahawk helicopter, fly right up to the vessel, visually identify its markings, and then physically threaten to board or sink it.
And that requirement, getting right up close, that's the fatal flaw in the plan, isn't it? Because getting close to the Iranian coastline right now is apparently a death sentence.
That is the crux of it. The technological playing field has leveled in a way the U.S. Navy hasn't fully adapted to. Iran has built a layered, deeply redundant coastal defense grid.
We're not just talking about a few guys with shoulder-fired rockets here.
No, not at all. We are talking about highly advanced coastal defense cruise missiles, precision close-range ballistic missiles, and an absolute swarm of drones. And those drones are what they call a three-dimensional threat.
Three-dimensional.
Yeah. Aerial drones, explosive surface water drones, and unmanned underwater vehicles. If a U.S. surface asset crosses within roughly 200 miles of that coast, it enters a highly lethal kill box.
Wow. And this isn't just theoretical wargaming, is it? There's a specific chilling data point in this analysis about the USS Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, an entire aircraft carrier strike group.
Right.
The detail here is stunning. Back in March, the Abraham Lincoln pushed into that 200-mile envelope, reportedly around 220 miles out, and was actively engaged.
Okay.
And the terrifying metric is that the carrier was attacked from 17 different vectors simultaneously.
Wait, 17 sides.
17 sides at once.
Let's pause and think about the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
I mean, an aircraft carrier doesn't travel alone, right?
Yeah.
It's surrounded by cruisers and destroyers equipped with the Aegis combat system, which is arguably the best air defense radar on Earth.
It is phenomenal technology.
Right. It's designed to track hundreds of targets and shoot them down with interceptor missiles. But how does that math hold up when 17 different threats, maybe a mix of low-flying cruise missiles, high-diving ballistic missiles, and sea-skimming drones, arrive at the exact same moment?
The math breaks. And that's exactly what asymmetric warfare is designed to do.
Just overwhelm the system.
Precisely. The Aegis system is amazing, but it has physical limits. An interceptor missile costs millions of dollars. An Iranian Shahed drone costs maybe $20,000.
Jeez.
So if you launch a swarm from 17 different azimuths, you are forcing the carrier's defense computers to prioritize targets in fractions of a second. Even if the defense system works with 95% efficiency, in a swarm of 17, that 5% failure rate means a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier takes a direct hit.
Which completely changes the risk calculus.
Completely asymmetric.
Which explains the absolutely wild detour of the USS George H.W. Bush. When I read this part, I actually had to pull up a globe to make sure I was understanding it right.
Yeah, it's hard to believe.
Because normally, if an East Coast carrier needs to get to the Middle East, it sails across the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, down the Suez Canal, into the Red Sea, and boom, you're there.
That's the standard route.
But the Bush didn't do that.
No. According to the analysis, the Navy command was so terrified of the carrier being targeted by Houthi anti-ship missiles and drones in the narrow confines of the Red Sea that they entirely abandoned the Suez route.
They just gave up on it.
They sent one of the most powerful warships ever constructed on a massive detour all the way down the west coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, just to avoid the theater of operations until the last possible second.
That is the ultimate geopolitical tell. That's like needing to drive from New York to Los Angeles, but taking a detour through Argentina just to avoid a bad intersection in Chicago.
It's exactly like that.
When your primary instrument of power projection is taking continent-sized detours out of fear of asymmetrical drone strikes, the idea that you are projecting an impenetrable blockade is a fantasy. You're effectively deterred.
You're present, but you are paralyzed. And this paralysis creates an immense, grinding logistical nightmare.
Because ships can't just stay out there forever.
Right. You have to remember, military hardware is incredibly fragile in a corrosive saltwater environment. Ships need constant maintenance. Jets require hundreds of hours of upkeep for every hour they fly. The crews need sleep. You can't just park a carrier in the Indian Ocean indefinitely.
Right, they need a pit stop. But the local bases in the Middle East that the U.S. usually relies on have reportedly been hammered. So where do they go?
The closest viable, secure hub mentioned in the analysis is Diego Garcia.
Okay, for anyone who hasn't stared at a naval map recently, Diego Garcia is a tiny remote atoll in the absolute middle of the Indian Ocean.
It is incredibly isolated.
It is thousands of miles away from the Strait of Hormuz.
It's the definition of strategic overstretch. If your F-18 fighters have to fly out of Diego Garcia, or your ships have to sail back there for refueling and refits, you are burning incredible amounts of fuel, airframe life, and human endurance just to commute to the battlefield.
Just to show up.
Exactly. By the time an aircraft reaches the patrol zone, it has minimal loiter time before it has to turn around. You are exhausting your military infrastructure just to clock in.
And it seems like the reality of this lethal environment has deeply rattled the Pentagon. There's a mention of a recent attempt to rescue a downed F-15 crew member.
Yeah, that incident.
The details are classified, but the strategic takeaway is apparently massive.
The takeaway is that the environment is so thoroughly contested that a standard search and rescue operation became an absolute debacle.
A gabawker.
And the conclusion drawn by military leadership from that single event is that putting any boots on the ground, any conventional ground operations whatsoever, is completely off the table. It is simply deemed too lethal.
So let's step back and look at the whole board here. The U.S. is trying to enforce a blockade to project power, but the ships enforcing it are acting like mall cops because they can't get close.
Right.
The carriers that are supposed to back them up are dodging 17-vector drone swarms and sailing around Africa to avoid getting sunk. The logistics tether stretches thousands of miles to a speck in the ocean, and ground troops are a hard no.
It's bad.
That is a military apparatus that is fundamentally redlining.
It is redlining, but, military overstretch doesn't happen in a vacuum. When you try to choke off a maritime artery as vital as the Strait of Hormuz with a compromised military, the shockwaves don't just stay in the water.
No, they don't.
They instantly slam into the global economy.
Which brings us to the wallet. Because geopolitics can feel incredibly abstract, right? We talk about missile envelopes and naval logistics, and it sounds like a game of Risk.
Right, lines on a map.
But you cannot mess with the flow of oil without it immediately showing up at the grocery store for you and me. This military strain is the direct trigger for an economic earthquake.
And to understand the mechanics of that earthquake, we have to look at the massive contradiction in U.S. energy policy right now.
Yeah, walk me through this.
The analysis lays out this incredible paradox. Recently, the administration quietly lifted sanctions on Russian and Iranian oil. They needed that crude flowing into the global market to suppress prices and keep inflation from exploding.
Makes perfect sense. More supply equals lower prices at the pump.
But then, suddenly, they reverse course. They snap the sanctions back onto Russia and simultaneously launch this naval blockade against Iran. In one clumsy maneuver, they effectively tried to rip 20% of the world's total oil supply out of the market.
20%. You can't just delete a fifth of the energy that powers human civilization and expect the engine to keep humming.
You really can't.
But here's where the story gets really bizarre. If you turn on a financial news network today and look at the oil futures ticker, the WTI or Brent crude prices, it doesn't look like an apocalypse.
No, it looks fine.
Right. The prices on paper actually seem somewhat stable, maybe even dipping a bit.
That is the illusion of the paper market. Wall Street futures are just traders making bets on where the price might be months from now, often completely detached from physical reality.
So they aren't looking at the actual barrel.
Not at all. But the analysis points us to where the truth actually lives, the physical market. You have to look at what happens when a real physical tanker full of crude oil pulls into a port to be refined.
Okay.
And the prime example is Singapore, one of the massive beating hearts of global oil refining. In Singapore, the actual physical price of a barrel of oil has decoupled from the paper market and absolutely skyrocketed.
Like how high?
We are talking about real-world prices hitting $140 a barrel, with some transactions reportedly touching $210 a barrel.
Wait, $210?
Yes.
Just to put that in perspective for you listening, anytime oil creeps over $100, central bankers start sweating profusely because inflation is about to bite. At $210 a barrel, the foundational math of the modern world just breaks.
It completely shatters.
Everything you touch, eat, or buy requires oil to manufacture or transport.
Exactly. And this is where the macroeconomic theory hits the dirt. The analysis uses a brilliant microexample to show exactly how a $210 barrel of oil in Singapore destroys a livelihood thousands of miles away.
Yeah, the rancher.
It's the story of a rancher down in Florida.
I love this example because it strips away all the geopolitical jargon.
Yeah.
Let's walk through this rancher's actual ledger.
You did.
First, you have the immediate, obvious impact, diesel fuel. Because of the global supply shock, this rancher is suddenly paying over $2 more per gallon for diesel. That is an instant 40% hike in his operating costs just to turn the key on his tractors and haul his cattle.
It's massive. But the hidden cost is the fertilizer.
Right.
People forget that modern agriculture is essentially turning fossil fuels into food. The Haber-Bosch process to make nitrogen fertilizer is incredibly energy-intensive, heavily reliant on natural gas.
So when energy goes up,
When the global energy market spikes, fertilizer costs explode. For this rancher, the cost of fertilizer has tripled.
triple. So his fuel's up 40%, his fertilizer is up 300%. That's already a crisis.
It's a disaster.
But then, nature decides to pile on. Florida gets hit with a severe drought. The grass stops growing. The cattle have nothing to graze on. So to prevent his herd from starving to death, he has to import hay.
And here is where the compounding math of inflation becomes fatal. In a normal, good year, he might need to supplement with 40 bales of hay, historically priced around $40 a bale.
Right, that's a $1,600 expense. It's manageable.
But remember, the cost to grow, harvest, and transport that hay has also skyrocketed because of the energy crisis. So the price per bale more than doubles, jumping from $40 to $90.
Oh, wow.
And because of the drought, 40 bales won't cut it. He needs 90 bales.
So do the math. 90 bales multiplied by the new price of $90 a bale. His emergency feed costs just went from a manageable $1,600 to $3,600. And that is just one single line item for one guy in Florida.
And what does he say in the interview? He says, "I'm in the red." He is actively losing money every single day he operates.
That's terrifying.
What's fascinating here is if you connect that rancher to the broader structural flaw of the 21st century. Over the last 30 years, we have optimized the entire global economy for extreme cutthroat efficiency. It's called just-in-time logistics.
Right, no warehouses.
Exactly. We decided that keeping inventory in warehouses was a waste of capital, so we eliminated them. We rely on the ships, the trucks, and the trains, moving with absolute clockwork precision, delivering goods the exact hour they're needed.
It's like driving 90 miles an hour on the highway, drafting mere inches from the bumper of an 18-wheeler.
That is a great way to put it.
It is incredibly fuel efficient as long as everyone maintains speed. But the second that truck taps the brakes, you are going straight through the windshield. We built a global system with absolutely zero shock absorbers.
A perfect analogy. And a $210 barrel of oil is not just tapping the brakes, it's a brick wall. When agricultural input costs triple, farmers cannot absorb that hit. They either go bankrupt and stop producing food, or they pass those massively inflated costs onto the grocery store shelf.
Which hits all of us.
And the consumer on the other end is already maxed out on credit cards, living paycheck to paycheck. The overarching warning here isn't just about expensive gas, it's that this energy shock is the catalyst for a potential collapse of the global food system.
So if the military is running on fumes and dodging drones, and the global food supply chain is beginning to buckle under the weight of $200 oil, you have to ask the obvious question: who is driving this bus?
Right.
What is the grand strategy inside the White House that is making these decisions?
And this is where the analysis takes us inside the Oval Office. And again, a quick reminder for everyone listening. We are looking at this through the specific, highly critical lens of the source material.
Exactly.
We're examining the internal dynamics as they are reported by these insiders.
Absolutely. And the portrait painted of the commander-in-chief is incredibly grim. The defining characteristic they use over and over is erratic.
Erratic and fundamentally isolated. The claim is that the president is emotionally volatile and completely detached from the actual physical reality of what is happening on the ground.
How detached are we talking?
The analysis suggests he literally doesn't remember his own policy positions from one day to the next. He operates on a set of facts that simply do not exist, like genuinely believing that Iran is on its knees begging for a ceasefire, when all the strategic indicators suggest the United States is the one desperate for an off-ramp.
And a huge part of that detachment seems to stem from a severely manufactured information bubble.
Yes.
The claim is that his daily intelligence intake has been whittled down to almost nothing. He's reportedly just watching Fox News and reading the New York Times. And if someone brings him hard intelligence that contradicts his worldview, he flies into a rage and verbally attacks the messenger.
Which naturally creates a deeply toxic, fearful environment among his staff. The metaphor used in the analysis is deeply unsettling.
Yeah, this part was rough.
They compare the West Wing staff to kids living with an alcoholic, abusive father. Everyone is constantly tiptoeing around, hiding the truth, and desperately trying to manage his mood swings to avoid triggering a meltdown.
I want to push back on this narrative of pure incompetence for a second, because in geopolitics, we often see leaders feign instability as a tactic.
Sure.
Think of Richard Nixon's madman theory, acting so unpredictable and unhinged that the Soviets and North Vietnamese thought he might actually drop a nuclear bomb over a minor dispute. It was a strategy to force concessions.
The unpredictable wild card.
Right. Could this chaotic messaging, ordering a blockade one day, demanding an open strait the next, and then claiming the whole thing as a favor to Beijing, could this be a highly calculated 5D chess move to keep America's adversaries off balance?
It's a fair question, but the analysis violently rejects the 5D chess theory. For the madman theory to work, the madman still needs to know exactly what is happening on the board. He needs accurate intelligence to know how his adversaries are reacting to his performance. The chaos described here isn't a performance, it's a symptom of a broken feedback loop.
So who is breaking the loop?
The claim is that the military apparatus, specifically pointing the finger at figures like Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon, are actively and intentionally lying to the president.
Lying about what specifically?
Lying about victory. Because the president attacks anyone who brings bad news, the Pentagon is allegedly feeding him a fabricated, relentlessly rosy picture.
Just telling what he wants to hear?
Exactly. They tell him, Mr. President, the strikes were a massive success. We destroyed their vital infrastructure. We eliminated their leadership. But the reality, according to this intelligence assessment, is that the U.S. strikes are largely ineffective, and the Iranians are repairing and rebuilding their sites almost immediately.
And he just never knows.
The president never hears that part. He is completely walled off from the failure.
So you have a commander-in-chief operating inside a delusion of total victory, while the actual military is stretched to the breaking point. Is absolutely no one in the room raising their hand and pointing to the $210 oil and the broken supply chains?
You would think so.
Is there no adult in the room screaming to hit the brakes?
According to the analysis, there is exactly one person trying to pull the emergency brake, and that is Vice President JD Vance. The claim is that Vance clearly sees the disaster unfolding and is desperately trying to engineer a diplomatic off-ramp.
And what exactly does Vance's escape hatch look like?
Vance's proposed solution was essentially to resurrect the ghost of the JCPOA, the old Iran nuclear deal.
Wow, really?
Now, politically, they could never call it that. It would be political suicide. But the mechanics would be identical. Implement permanent, aggressive, on-site inspections by the IAEA to absolutely guarantee Iran cannot develop a nuclear weapon, and in exchange, the U.S. lifts the crippling economic sanctions.
A trade-off.
Vance wanted to pitch it as a forever agreement that would pacify the region and guarantee Israel's long-term security.
But that plan died on the vine, didn't it? The analysis says Vance actually had a 10-point peace framework ready to go. He was making headway. And then the political reality of Washington crushed it.
It did. The pressure reportedly came down from massive Zionist political donors who have immense leverage over the administration. They fundamentally opposed any normalization or sanctions relief for Iran.
So they vetoed it.
Yeah, so the president scrapped Vance's 10-point plan entirely. And worse than just rejecting the plan, the analysis describes the president actively humiliating and isolating Vance, basically telling him to shut up, fall in line, and stop trying to play diplomat.
And when you humiliate your top diplomat and shut down the only realistic off-ramp, you create a massive vacuum.
Yeah.
The United States effectively paralyzes itself. But here's the thing about global geopolitics. The rest of the world doesn't just hit pause and sit quietly while Washington figures out its internal drama.
Exactly. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the international order. If the U.S. is paralyzed, other powers are going to step in to secure their own interests.
Right.
And that dynamic leads us to a truly surreal sequence of events regarding how diplomacy in the Middle East is actually functioning right now.
The story about the collapse of the U.S.-Iran talks is just wild. Walk me through the mechanics of this walkout.
So, you have the U.S. delegation, which Vance had been leading, sitting across from the Iranian delegation led by Foreign Minister Araghchi. They are deep in negotiations trying to find a ceasefire. And suddenly, the U.S. team just packs up their briefcases and leaves.
Wait, they didn't declare an impasse. They didn't say, we need to take this back to the president for review.
No. According to the report, they didn't say a single word. They simply vanished.
You're kidding.
The Iranian diplomats were sitting there looking around, literally asking, where did the Americans go? It is a breathtaking violation of basic diplomatic protocol. It signals an administration that is so internally chaotic it can't even formally conclude a meeting.
But the truly defining moment is what happens next. The negotiations are dead, so the Iranian diplomats have to fly home. But they refused to fly on an Iranian state aircraft. Why?
Because they were absolutely terrified that the moment an Iranian government plane entered international airspace, it would be shot down by Israel.
Just blown right out of the sky.
The fear of targeted assassination was so high that these high-level government officials had to quietly book tickets on a commercial Pakistani-flagged airliner just to ensure they wouldn't be killed on their way home.
Think about the implication of that. The bedrock of international diplomacy, going back thousands of years, is the concept of safe conduct for envoys. You don't kill the messenger.
Right, it's the oldest rule.
But this analysis argues that the assassination of political leaders and negotiators has become a totally normalized, accepted form of deterrence in the Middle East. If a foreign minister cannot safely fly to a peace conference, then the mechanics of making peace are fundamentally broken.
It destroys trust at a molecular level. If the U.S. is ghosting negotiations and the airspace is a free fire zone for diplomats, Washington has effectively removed itself from the equation. So a new coalition is stepping into the void.
And the roster of this new coalition is the ultimate wake-up call. We're talking about Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey actively collaborating to draft a comprehensive Middle East peace settlement.
Yeah.
Notice the glaring omission. The United States is not in the room.
They aren't just absent, they are being actively engineered out of the region's future. Russia and China are proving to the Gulf states that they can broker stability where the U.S. only brings erratic conflict.
And the Gulf states are motivated right now.
Highly motivated. The reason these regional powers like the Saudis and the UAE are so desperate for a deal, even one brokered by Beijing, is because they are bleeding heavily. The narrative in the West is that Israel and the Gulf states are relatively untouched, but the analysis shreds that illusion.
Let's start with Israel. The media portrays the Iron Dome as this magical, impenetrable force field. But the source points to a recent, intense 12-day war with Hezbollah up in Lebanon.
Right. And the claim is that during those 12 days, Hezbollah penetrated those defenses and inflicted massive structural damage on Israeli infrastructure and economic centers.
But we didn't see that on the news.
But you don't see it on the news because of incredibly strict, pervasive military censorship. The logic the analyst applies is simple. If the Iron Dome had intercepted everything, Israel would be inviting CNN and the BBC to film the pristine cities and brag about their technological superiority.
Makes sense.
The fact that there is a total media blackout strongly implies they took a massive drubbing that they cannot afford to show the world.
And it's crucial to understand the timeline here. The analysis forces us to look backward. This fight with Hezbollah isn't a new flare-up that can be solved with a quick bombing run. The analyst explicitly ties this current violence all the way back to a specific event in 1975.
Yeah, a long time ago.
A Christian Phalangist militia attacking a bus and killing 35 Shia civilians, which became the match that lit the Lebanese civil war.
By anchoring the conflict in 1975, he's demonstrating that this is a 51-year generational blood feud. It is a grinding war of attrition. Hezbollah was born in the crucible of that civil war and the subsequent invasions. They are designed to absorb punishment.
They can take a hit.
The argument is that in a long-term war of attrition, Hezbollah can endure, while Israel's high-tech, highly interconnected economy simply cannot sustain continuous missile impacts.
And the damage isn't contained to Israel. The Gulf states, the monarchies that the U.S. has sworn to protect for decades, are apparently in ruins. Let's run down the list. Bahrain, home to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. The analysis literally calls it toast.
Toast. Meaning the infrastructure supporting the U.S. naval presence is so severely compromised that it is effectively neutralized as a forward operating base.
And what about Kuwait?
Kuwait has also taken heavy damage, but the most staggering assessment concerns the United Arab Emirates.
Of the UAE.
The UAE has historically been the most aggressive, vocal opponent of Iran in the Gulf. And because of that, they have taken an absolute beating. The phrase used in the analysis to describe the UAE's condition is beyond recoverable.
Beyond recoverable. The glittering towers of Dubai, the financial hubs, subjected to infrastructure crippling strikes. And this introduces a really fascinating, cynical element to the diplomacy.
It really does.
The push for a ceasefire might not be driven by a desire for humanitarian peace, but by raw panic over private equity.
Follow the money. The analysis explicitly names Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. Both are incredibly wealthy, influential figures with deep, direct access to the president.
Right.
And both have massive, multi-billion-dollar real estate and private equity investments tied up in the UAE.
So when the UAE infrastructure gets pulverized by Iranian or Houthi drones, their personal wealth is quite literally going up in smoke.
Exactly. The implication is that these financial titans are putting immense backdoor pressure on the White House to force a ceasefire, purely to salvage their portfolios before they suffer total catastrophic losses. It's geopolitics driven by the panic of billionaires.
There is one piece of Gulf infrastructure that is supposedly still functioning, though. Saudi Arabia. They seem to be playing a very dangerous game of balancing both sides.
The Saudis are acutely aware of their vulnerability. They are placating Washington while simultaneously begging Tehran for mercy. And the analysis notes that a massive Saudi oil pipeline, which bypasses the Strait of Hormuz and pumps crude directly to the Red Sea, has been repaired and is flowing again.
That's a lot of oil.
It's moving about 7 million barrels a day.
Which sounds like a victory until you look at where that pipe ends. It terminates at a port on the Red Sea, right in the backyard of the Houthis in Yemen.
It is the ultimate Achilles heel. The pipeline is functioning, but it exists entirely at the mercy of the Houthis.
So they could just shut it down.
If the conflict reignites, the analyst predicts the Houthis will simply target that Red Sea terminus with a swarm of cheap drones and shut down 7 million barrels a day in an afternoon. The Gulf's economic survival is hanging by a thread.
Okay, let's zoom out. We've established that the U.S. military is exhausted, the global economy is fracturing, the White House is lost in a delusion of its own making, and the Middle East is burning while Russia and China broker the peace.
A pretty bleak picture.
Very bleak. But here's where it gets really interesting, and the narrative shifts from a regional disaster to an existential crisis. Because while America bleeds out in the desert, Beijing is watching, learning, and arming.
The entire premise of American foreign policy over the last decade was the pivot to Asia. The idea that the U.S. needed to extricate itself from Middle Eastern forever wars to contain the rise of China.
Right. Focus on the Pacific.
What this analysis argues is that not only did the pivot fail, but China has actually followed the U.S. back into the Middle East and is actively shifting the military balance of power.
And they are doing it by fundamentally altering Iran's defensive capabilities. The Pentagon planners, the ones actually looking at radar telemetry, not the ones giving the president rosy briefings, are terrified because Iran isn't relying on 1980s Soviet surplus radar anymore.
Not at all. The intelligence indicates that China has stepped in and systematically upgraded Iran's air defense network.
How advanced are we talking?
We are talking about state-of-the-art Chinese radar arrays, electronic warfare suites, and surface-to-air missile systems. And this is where the technological edge that the U.S. has relied on for 30 years suddenly evaporates.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that, because the claim is that even the F-35, the crown jewel of American stealth technology, an aircraft that costs over $100 million each, is now highly vulnerable over Iranian airspace. How does a Chinese radar upgrade suddenly defeat American stealth?
It comes down to physics and networking. Stealth doesn't make a jet invisible. It just makes its radar signature incredibly small, like the size of a golf ball, to high-frequency targeting radars. But what the Chinese have perfected and allegedly exported to Iran are advanced networked arrays using lower-frequency radar bands. Lower frequencies can detect the general shape of stealth aircraft from hundreds of miles away.
Wait, really? Hundreds of miles?
Yes. They might not give you a precise enough track to guide a missile immediately, but if you network dozens of these sensors together using high-speed data links, you can triangulate the F-35's position and pass that data to a terminal defense system.
So we can see them coming.
The U.S. planners look at this upgraded networked grid and realize that if they send F-35s in, a statistically significant number of them are going to be shot down.
And China's involvement is not subtle. The analysis notes that unidentified Chinese cargo flights are currently actively landing in Iran, presumably offloading more of this advanced hardware.
It's a direct intravenous injection of Chinese military technology into a U.S. combat theater, and the diplomatic theater surrounding it is almost farcical.
Right, because publicly, Washington and Beijing are playing this bizarre game of make-believe. The U.S. president stands at a podium and says, "I laid down the law, I told China not to arm Iran, and they respected my authority."
Yeah, that's the script.
And Xi Jinping stands at a podium and says, "We are a peaceful nation. We are not supplying weapons to escalate this conflict." They both want the exact same headline, so they both lie and pretend the arms pipeline doesn't exist.
But the reality on the ground is that China is building an impenetrable fortress out of Iran, and China's protective umbrella extends over the water, too. We talked earlier about Chinese oil tankers casually ignoring the U.S. Malcop blockade. What happens if an American destroyer commander decides they've had enough, fires a warning shot, and attempts to board a Chinese-flagged vessel?
The analysis says China has laid down an absolute, unambiguous red line. They have stated that any kinetic interference with their maritime traffic by the U.S. Navy will be interpreted as an act of war.
And an act of war with China in 2026 is the nightmare scenario, because the fundamental question the analyst asks is, if the U.S. decides to call China's bluff, could America win a conventional war in the Pacific?
And his answer is terrifyingly blunt. He says no. He claims the United States wouldn't last 2 weeks in a high-intensity conventional conflict with China.
2 weeks?
2 weeks. That sounds insane.
Yeah.
Spend nearly $1 trillion a year on defense. How do you burn through the U.S. military in 14 days?
Because of a fatal lack of strategic depth. A military is only as powerful as its magazine depth, how many missiles it can fire before it runs out. And the U.S. has spent the last few years draining its magazines to zero.
Where do they all go?
They shipped massive amounts of munitions to Ukraine for that proxy war, and now they're burning through whatever is left trying to defend ships in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf.
Let's get specific, because the hardware he lists as depleted is the backbone of the U.S. arsenal. We are out of PAC-C3 interceptors, which is the missile the Patriot battery fires to shoot down incoming ballistics.
Yep.
We are out of JDAMs, the GPS guidance kits that turn dumb bombs into precision weapons. We were out of JGHSMs, the stealthy air-launched cruise missiles, and we are out of Tomahawks, the long-range cruise missiles fired from Navy destroyers.
If you don't have those 4 weapons, you cannot fight a modern war. You are a heavyweight boxer who showed up to a title fight without gloves.
But the standard American response to this is historical confidence. We say, so what if we're out? This is the arsenal of democracy. We'll invoke the Defense Production Act, fire up the factories in Ohio and Texas, and build 100,000 new missiles just like we built bombers in World War II.
That's the myth we tell ourselves.
But the analyst points out a fatal flaw in that logic, and it centers on something called rare earth elements.
This is the ultimate paralyzing irony of the 21st century military-industrial complex. To build a Tomahawk missile or a PAC-3 interceptor, you need highly advanced guidance sensors, servo motors to mill the fins, and radar seekers.
And what are those made of?
Every single one of those components requires permanent magnets made from rare earth elements, specifically materials like neodymium and dysprosium.
And who controls the global supply of neodymium?
China. They don't just mine it. They possess a near-total global monopoly on the incredibly complex, toxic chemical refining processes required to turn raw ore into military-grade magnets. You cannot build a modern American missile without Chinese rare earths.
It is a strategic checkmate of epic proportions. You are threatening to go to war against China, but to build the weapons you need to shoot at China, you have to humbly ask Beijing to sell you the components.
You literally cannot fight a war of attrition against your own supply chain.
You can't. And China knows it. The analysis points out that China has already restricted the export of these critical minerals to the U.S. So the production lines for these missiles are throttled. The U.S. is trapped. They cannot escalate militarily against China, and they cannot sustain the current operational tempo in the Middle East.
And when the world realizes that the reigning superpower is physically incapable of projecting power, the entire global architecture begins to collapse. Which leads us to the final phase of this analysis, the waning superpower.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, how does this military impotence translate into geopolitical and domestic ruin?
Well, the first pillar to fall is always the currency. The U.S. dollar's dominance isn't just about economics. It's backed by the implicit guarantee of American military supremacy. The world uses the dollar because the U.S. Navy keeps the sea lanes open.
Exactly.
When the Navy fails, the dollar wobbles. And the analyst points to a massive red flashing light: de-dollarization.
We've heard de-dollarization thrown around as a buzzword for years, but he points to a specific, tangible event that just occurred.
Yes, a recent auction for U.S. Treasury bills. This is how the U.S. government funds itself. It sells debt to the rest of the world. Historically, foreign central banks gobble up treasuries because it's the safest asset on earth.
The gold standard of debt.
But in this specific auction, the participation from foreign buyers completely cratered. The demand vanished. It was so bad that the Federal Reserve had to step in and buy the debt themselves just to prevent the auction from failing.
When the Federal Reserve has to buy its own government's debt because the world doesn't want it, that is the definition of monetizing the debt. It's essentially printing money which is a one-way ticket to hyperinflation. It is a massive global vote of no confidence.
And that economic no-confidence vote translates instantly to diplomatic abandonment, especially in Asia. The nations that the U.S. has spent decades courting to build a wall against China, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, are watching this disaster unfold.
They are watching the U.S. fail to protect the UAE from drones, they are watching the Mall Cop blockade, and they are doing the math.
Precisely. They are realizing that American security guarantees are hollow. So they are quietly slipping out the back door. They are charting their own diplomatic courses, seeking accommodation with Beijing, and decoupling from Washington's geopolitical demands.
The collapse of prestige is so total that the analyst floats a hypothetical scenario that is just dripping with humiliation.
Oh, the toll road thing.
Yes. He suggests that Iran, feeling completely victorious and emboldened by Chinese backing, might start treating the Strait of Hormuz like a toll road. They could literally set up a system demanding commercial shipping pay a user fee to transit the Gulf, using the extorted revenue to rebuild the infrastructure that the U.S. and Israel destroyed.
Imagine the historical poetry of that defeat. The United States launches a multi-billion-dollar naval blockade to crush Iran, fails entirely, and the end result is that Iran gains the authority to legally tax global capitalism for the privilege of sailing past its shores.
It's the end of an era, and a failure of that magnitude does not stay overseas. It comes home to roost. You cannot have $210 oil bankrupting farmers, a humiliated military, and hyperinflation without it ripping the domestic political fabric to shreds.
It's just not possible.
The analysis concludes by looking at the brutal political math facing the administration in the upcoming midterms.
He points to the predictive betting markets, places like Polymarket, where people are putting real money on political outcomes. And the data is predicting an absolute slaughter for the president's party.
It's not just losing the House of Representatives, it's a structural collapse. The markets are projecting the opposition party could sweep the Senate, potentially securing 54 or 55 seats.
It means a net loss of 10 or more seats in a single cycle.
Yeah.
It's a political bloodbath. And if that happens, the president's legislative agenda is instantly, permanently dead.
The analyst outlines two ways the rest of the term plays out, and neither of them involves governing. Scenario one is outright impeachment, driven by a furious opposition party looking for vengeance over the economic collapse.
And scenario two.
Scenario two is arguably worse for the psychology of a leader. He describes the president becoming a completely neutered, paralyzed lame duck. The visual metaphor he uses is brutal. He says the president would be left to twist slowly in the wind like a body hanging off of a scaffold.
Man, that is a dark image.
It's very dark, but it speaks to the absolute vacuum of power. The administration would devolve into furious infighting, blame shifting, and panic. And panic is the absolute last emotion you want brewing in a commander-in-chief who is backed into a corner, stripped of his conventional military options, but still possesses the launch codes to the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet.
So we have pulled an immense amount of thread today. We started by looking at a naval blockade that isn't blocking anything, enforced by ships operating the absolute limit of their logistical tether, terrified of cheap drones.
Right.
We traced how that physical failure on the water ignited a catastrophic spike in the physical price of oil, threatening to shatter a global food system built on zero inventory and cheap diesel.
We peered into an isolated White House functioning on manufactured intelligence, actively silencing the only voices calling for diplomacy. We watched as American diplomats literally abandoned the negotiating table, leaving a vacuum that Russia and China eagerly filled to redraw the map of the Middle East.
And we faced the chilling reality of a depleted American military, out of missiles, out of the rare earth minerals required to build them, and fundamentally outmatched by Chinese industrial capacity. A reality that is driving the world to abandon the dollar and leaving a U.S. president politically dangling in the wind.
The analysis we walk through today is dense, it is controversial, and it is undeniably bleak. But understanding the mechanics of these arguments is vital, because this isn't abstract theory.
No, it's very real.
If the structural frailties identified here, the fragile supply chains, the vulnerability of surface fleets, the reliance on foreign supply chains for basic defense, if these are true, it alters the trajectory of your life.
Exactly. It alters the price of the food you buy, the value of the money in your pocket, and the stability of the world you live in. We started this hour talking about the illusion of control, the idea that drawing a line on a map with a warship equals absolute power. But as we've seen, power is a fragile, interconnected web.
Very fragile.
So I want to leave you with a thought to chew on as you go about your day. If the world watches a superpower fail to enforce a simple blockade, if they watch its diplomats walk away in silence, and if they watch its military run out of ammunition, at what exact moment does the rest of the globe simply stop waiting for Washington's permission to build the future? What does a post-American world order actually feel like when it finally arrives at your doorstep? Thank you for coming along on this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the consensus, keep digging into the mechanics of the world, and we'll catch you next time.